Welcome. Again, thank you for coming to my panel instead of MAGFest, because I honestly didn't think a whole lot of people would. So especially at 9 o'clock at night, learning about audio seems like a little bit of a stretch. But this old man up here will give it a shot. All right. So my name is Dr. Jonathan Cresci. I'm the CMO of Fundamental Sounds. You can reach me at Jonathan at Fundamental Sounds or at the website fundamentalsounds.com or at Fund Sounds Twitter. The DMs are open, so if you need to talk to me, just send me a DM and tell me that you were in the panel and let me know your questions. So I'm passionate about education and passionate about audio education because one of the things that I want to do, I've been an educator for a really long time. I've been a university professor for probably 20 years and a trumpet professor, so I'm a trumpet player, but also a audio production professor. And I recently moved to Little Rock with my wife. She got a really good job, so I moved from the DC, Baltimore area to Little Rock, Arkansas. And so now I'm doing this and coming to places like MAGFest to talk about audio and to try to get you interested in learning more about it. Probably the biggest thing that I find frustrating is with audio is the fact that there's a distinct lack of fundamental principles or first principles. So a first principle is like the building block of how you establish knowledge in something, right? If any of you are engineers, you all know quite well about first principles because my wife's a biomedical engineer also along as a doctor, and she's the one who taught me about first principles and how you can really find the answer to anything if you go back there, right? And so that's something that we don't talk about. Like if you go on YouTube to try to figure out how a compressor works or how should I use an EQ, they just give you these general things that they talk about and like, you should do this. And like I cannot tell you how many times I get the question of, how do you mic a drum set? Well, that depends. Who's your drummer? What's your drum set? What room is it in? What kind of mics do you have? You know, what kind of genre of music you're doing? Like, you know, there's tons of things. But if you know some of the stuff I'm about to teach you tonight, it can make that question a lot easier for you to answer for yourself. Because that ultimately is the most important thing. Yes, I would love to create a paid website that everybody came to get all the answers for everything and make me a very rich man. But I know that that's not going to happen, and it's not important. What's really important is raising the level of music, right? It's just like what you heard. That was going very outside the box for Kyle. Kyle's a classically trained trumpet player. He also does jazz and commercial work, but we did something that is frowned upon in the classical community. We made an EDM album, right? And billing it as a classical album because frankly, nobody wants to play classical music anymore. I mean, that's not true for any of you who are classical musicians. I am one myself, but you know, as a trumpet player, the last thing I want to do is play the Haydn Trumpet Concerto once again, or listen to another trumpet player play it, right? So we're trying to expand, and I want to push with what Fundamental Sounds does is increasing the quality of music because the DIY community is not going away, right? I would love for all of you to pay me to do your work, but I know you want to do it yourself. So let's start learning how to do that. So we're going to start with the 7 basic characteristics of sound. There are tons of first principles that we could talk about, but I think this is the most bang for your buck. Right? And most people don't ever talk about this. The other bang for your buck is to always know when you're looking at signal flow that outs go to ins. And that's a thing. Outs go to ins is a big deal when you're trying to figure out why something doesn't work. So I have broken up these 7 basic characteristics that I learned when I was an undergrad. I broke them up into 3 sections. There are 3 domains. There's the amplitude domain, the time domain, and the frequency domain. The reason why I broke them up is because plugins operate that way, right? We have amplitude domain plugins, which are compressors, gates, and expanders. Then you have frequency domain plugins, such as equalizers, right? And then you have time domain plugins such as reverb, delay, phasers, and flangers. So, and then of course, because we live in a digital world, we have compressors that act like EQs and EQs that act like compressors. Like dynamic EQs are not the same thing as multi-band compressors, right? So they're starting to drift into one another. However, knowing these basic things will really help. So the first domain, Amplitude Domain, okay? The first thing that you have to know is that all sound has amplitude, meaning it has loudness. All sound has loudness, okay? I know that sounds really dumb, and you're going to look at a lot of these, and you're going to be like, "Whoa, man! Of course we know that sound has volume because we listen to it, right?" But you'd be surprised. So it's one of the basic characteristics. It's what we act on. Okay, it's what we act on when we're mixing something, right? We act on not only the frequency domain, but really primarily the amplitude domain. We're trying to level the instruments so they all sound equal and blend. Right? And for whatever reason, like I know there was a panel over in 6 that talked about mixing with your ears and like the emotion you want to bring out of things and the purpose and all of that. And that's all well and good. It's very good information. But you also need to think about, well, what is my goal? Right? When you're starting out, you need to know what is the basic thing I need to do. And it is make things not stick out unless you want them to stick out. So that's where amplitude comes in. How do we measure amplitude? Well, we actually measure it in volts because a microphone turns acoustic energy into electricity. But that doesn't really help us a whole lot. So we as audio engineers have come up with the decibel. Now, granted, it was Alexander Graham Bell who came up with the decibel, but still, I'll just take credit for it. So the decibel we all probably have heard also, right? We call them dBs. Oh, that's 0 dB or whatever, right? Well, the decibel is one logarithmic, so it is not linear. It does not get louder on a linear way. It does this, like that. And it's all reference-based. So if you're an analog person, you utilize the dBu. The dBu is represented by a reference, a 0 point marked at 0.775 volts. So if you've ever used a cassette deck, an analog tape recorder, all of those things, 0 was the Goldilocks zone. dBu, 0 dBu was Goldilocks. That was not loud enough to clip, but not soft enough to be covered up by noise, by specifically the tape noise, right? So you ask you, well, we're in the digital world. Why do we need to know this? Well, because in the digital world, we have DBFS, which stands for decibel full scale. This means 0 in DBFS means as loud as possible. See the difference? You've got Goldilocks zone, which is just right, and then you've got as loud as possible. So you don't want, in general, when you're recording, to put your music at 0 because there's no room to go anywhere. If you have one instrument hitting 0 on your in your mixer, none of the other instruments can be on without clipping. So we want to establish a fake Goldilocks zone, and that's up to you. It depends on the genre, right? In classical music, it tends to be -18 is our Goldilocks zone. So in digital world, we always think of negative numbers. And I know desperately that you're going to want to record in Reaper, if you saw my Reaper thing, or Pro Tools or whatever, and you're going to want those meters to look like they're as high as possible. But you don't. You want them to be nice in the middle, right? Nice low, somewhere where you have enough room to add your 100 billion tracks together that you've decided to put in your music so they don't clip. Because clipping is great if you mean to do it. If you don't mean to do it, then you're doing it wrong, okay? That's my big saying. If you know that you're doing it, do whatever you want. But if you're doing it by accident, it's wrong, okay? Just so you can understand that aspect. Cool thing to know about decibels. This is a general rule, by the way. But in general, people can only hear a 3 decibel difference. So if you move something up a half a decibel, They won't hear it. You might hear it because you're like super awesome and your ears are great, but the average person will not. So I always, when I'm raising and lowering something, like if I'm with a client and they're like, yeah, the cymbals need to come up a little bit, I move it up 3 decibels. Because I know a little bit means they just need to be able to hear it. Move up. And then if they go, oh, that's too much, then I might move it down, half that or something. But 3 decibels is really the smallest perceived difference. It also represents a doubling of power. So that means if you have one trumpet playing at 80 decibels and you have another trumpet playing at 80 decibels, together it is 83 decibels. Which means if you had an increase of like 20 decibels in something, that's really loud. That's like really loud. 3 decibels is really the doubling of power. But also remember that if you've got one, like let's say your kick drum is all the way up at 0 or close to 0, if you add one more track, you are definitely going to go over and clip. So you want everything to come down. So if you're doing like hard rock, maybe that's negative 12 dBFS. So you have 12 decibels of what we call headroom, right? Enough room to add more stuff, right? Classical music's 18 because we get really soft and then we get really loud. And so you want to capture all of that. And like maybe trance music, EDM, maybe you only need, 6 decibels. I don't know. It all depends on your genre that you're dealing with. Another thing that's interesting is called the inverse square law, but you don't need to know that. Just know that if I'm this close to the microphone, okay, what is that? Like, okay, 2 inches, right? If I then go to 4 inches, I am now 6 decibels softer than I was before. See? And if I bring it back, I am now 6 decibels louder. So now you know if you're recording something and it's too loud, move the microphone backwards. If it's not loud enough, move it forwards. Okay? You don't always have to turn the microphone pre to make it louder. You can just go in the room and put it closer. Now the problem with this is if I'm a speaker, right? I talked about this in the first one that I did, which I can't even remember what it was about, but it was about something. Oh, microphone choice. And if you get too close to a vocalist, you'll get what's called proximity effect, where everything gets louder and lower, right? So you have to balance how loud something is with how far away you are. But know that you can do this. That's why when singers are singing on stage and they want to sing really loud and passionately, you watch their microphone go away from their face and then it comes back. That's them like working this decibel thing to make sure they're not overloading any of the mic preamps and they don't distort anything. It's very helpful. So that's your decibel stuff. So think about that when you're working with compressors and when you're recording. You want to make sure you have headroom, and 3 decibels is the loudest perceived increment, right? Or the moment that you can hear something's different. The other thing you should probably also know, and I didn't put it in a slide and I just thought of it, is everything that is louder will sound better. For some reason in our brains as humans, and I don't know why, this is like a psychoacoustic thing, if it's louder, it's automatically better. And so we really have to be careful with that, because if you're mucking around with a compressor and you're like, wow, this sounds really good, but you forget the fact that you've made it louder than it was before, you don't actually know whether it's better. And so when you're mixing and when you're mastering and when you're doing stuff, you want to make sure that every move that you do does not increase the loudness of something. You can always make it louder later. But when you're making critical decisions, you want it to be the same. So if I use a compressor, I will compress it, and then I will go to the output of the compressor and I'll turn it down until when I bypass it back and forth, I don't hear a level difference. And then I can sit there and go, did this compressor do what I wanted it to do? Did it make the loud things soft? Because that's what compressors do. They make loud things soft. And so did it make it what I wanted it to do? Yes, great, moving on. No, change some settings. But if I leave it loud, most often I will go, oh yeah, that sounds great, and move on, and then not realize that, you know what, it doesn't sound great, because as soon as I turn it down, it sounds stupid. It's one of those things like when people have overly compressed music that's super, super loud. I used to work with a lot of black metal bands, and I used to joke with them because I'd come up and they'd be listening to their music and they're like, isn't this great? And it's fantastic. And I'd go up, man, it's too loud. And I'd turn it down and go, wow, that sounds really wimpy. It's really soft and not very loud. And it was because that joke was because there was no soft in the black metal music. It was all just loud. And so as soon as you turned it down, there was no contrast. But again, that's just the genre. I was just playing with them and making fun of them because that's what I do. But it is what it is, right? I'd like to say that for clients and as an instrumentalist and someone who's releasing music, remember, you don't control the volume knob. The person who's listening to it does. So you want to make sure your music sounds as good as possible at multiple volumes because, it could be old like me and I go, I don't like that, turn it down, and I'm like, now it sounds stupid. Whereas, you can't put like a disclaimer saying, make sure this is turned up at all times, right? The next thing, this is envelope. Every sound has an envelope, and this is what it looks like. Attack, decay, sustain, and release. If you do EDM music or you work with a sequencer, this is the ADSR curve. Stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. This is an amplitude domain thing. Every sound has one of these. I like to call it the articulation of a sound. So when I'm teaching an instrumentalist to do something, I actually pull this up and say, and you can make different graphs to say, this is what I want your articulation to look like. So you have that initial attack, right? And then it decays slightly before it sustains. And then you finally, when you stop playing, you release the note. Okay? By using compressors, act on this principle. Attack and release has nothing to do with this on the compressor itself. But they act on the envelope, right? Because a compressor, like let's say you want a snare drum to be more, I can't think of it, to crack more. I don't want to say punchy because I don't know what punchy means. And everybody thinks punchy is something different. But let's say you want it to hit harder. Well, you can set the compressor so that the attack of the snare drum, right, that initial attack is what triggers the compressor. But you can set the compressor so that it ignores it, right? There's a delay before it actually acts, before the compressor actually engages. And so you can set it so the attack goes through, triggers the compressor, and it pulls down the sustain. And it makes the decay drastic. And what that does is it eliminates the tone of the drum, but emphasizes the attack of the drum, makes it crack harder. However, if you want the drum to be more, have more tone and more thump, then you might want to increase or decrease the attack time on the compressor so it actually takes away some of that initial attack, but then leaves the sustain alone. So now you get a little less attack, but the sustain stays up. That's the tone of the drum is there. And so you have now used a compressor to alter the articulation of the drum by utilizing this. Because that every drum has this. Every trumpet has this. Every vocalist has this. Everybody has this. That's how compressors work. They work by altering this. By the way, a transient designer is a compressor. Right? I don't know why they make up new words for things. It's a compressor. It's always been a compressor. It's nothing special. It's a compressor, right? And so that's what you're doing. When you utilize a compressor, creatively utilize a compressor, you are acting on the envelope of a sound, okay? That's a creative thing. If you're just using a compressor for its initial purpose, which is to make loud things soft, then what you're doing is you're basically trying to eliminate the attack because you don't want the thing to actually break through the mix. You want it to sort of just sit there and not have it spike through the mix. So compressors are there to level things out, right? That was their initial purpose, right? And a limiter's initial purpose was to prevent radio stations from utilizing too much bandwidth and power. We just started using it in a creative manner because of that particular envelope, okay? Now we move on to the frequency domain. So far you've seen two characteristics of sound. You have amplitude and you have envelope. In the frequency domain, we start with frequency. Guess what? Frequency is measured in hertz and frequency is pitch. The pitch of a note, that's our psychoacoustic way of saying 440 is A. By the way, 440 could have been named anything, but we named it A. We could have named it Q for all anybody cared, right? Please don't go into this whole like if A were 432, the world would be full of peace and love, all right? It doesn't matter. None of us would even know, okay? By the way, A440 was developed by the Steinway Company in order to make tuning pianos easier. That is why it is what it is. So, pitch is frequency. The higher the frequency, right? The higher the frequency stands for its cycles per second, meaning a sine wave goes up, comes back down, and comes back up. That is a full cycle, right? It goes like that. And how many times that happens per second determines the pitch. The faster it is, the higher the pitch. The slower it is, the lower the pitch. Okay? That's what frequency is. All music has frequency. It also has wavelength. Wavelength is kind of like pitch because wavelength is inversely proportional to frequency, meaning the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. The lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. Now, what makes this interesting to you all is if, let's say, you're trying to make something sound further back in a mix. Something's pulled away, right? Something goes back into your mix. Well, psychoacoustically, or actually acoustically speaking, shorter wavelengths have less energy. So they don't make it very far. So the brighter something is, the closer you have to be to hear it. That's why if you hear somebody with big subwoofers in their car, you can hear them like 12 miles away, right? It's because low frequencies, they carry much further. They have more energy, which means if something is further away, it will be darker. It will lack upper harmonics. It will lack that brightness. So if you want something to sound further away, don't boost the high frequency, cut it off a little bit. That way it'll sound a little further back in the mix. Our brains know this because, again, higher frequencies have shorter wavelengths, so they don't make it as far. Where longer wavelengths, lower frequencies go much further, so we can hear that further away. I discussed this with microphones because microphones that are meant to be further out in a room have a frequency bump at 10 kilohertz, and that's what we see. Now the big one, so that's that. So wavelength and frequency, two more basic characteristics of sound. The big one, though, harmonic content. All music has harmonic content. Harmonic content means when, and I wish I had a piano here because it's the coolest demonstration in the whole world, right? You can hold the middle C down and you can play the harmonic series, which is this. And when you stop those other notes from playing, the middle C will ring, sympathetically ring. Okay, so harmonic content means that your music has not just the notes you're playing, but all of those other notes playing at the same time in varying degrees. So when you want to make, so like for instance, if you want to make a bass sound more present, you don't boost the fundamental of the bass, which is the note you're playing, because that won't make it sound more present, it just makes it louder. No, in order to make something present, right? Present means closer. It's got to be what? How do I make something closer? Brighter. You make it brighter to get it closer, right? So you go and you find the upper harmonics of the bass. So let's say your bass is playing an 80 hertz note, whatever that is. I don't know what that is, but let's just say it's playing that note. Well, if you double that note, that's an octave. If you quadruple it, that's another octave. And you can keep going up. Once you hit like 1600 hertz, like 1.6 kilohertz, you're up in the upper echelon of the harmonic series. If you boost up there, all of a sudden your bass will pop right out of the mix. And there isn't anything up there. There is no note that the bass is playing up there. But the harmonics of the string that the bass is plucking is up there. And when you boost that, not a lot, just a little, but when you boost that, all of a sudden you can hear the pluck more. And it's not the noise of the finger or whatever, but you hear that pluck more. It makes it more focused. It makes it more present because it brings it forward because of that brightness. However, if you have something that's really harsh, really in your face, and you need to move it back, you take those harmonics that are the upper harmonics and you roll them off. And that will just, it won't affect the notes that the instrument is playing or that your guitar is playing or any of these other things are playing or singing. But what it affects is the harmonic content. The less upper harmonics you have, the darker it is, right? The less lower harmonics you have, the brighter it is. I wish I had a spectrograph of like Kyle playing trumpet that you guys listen to. Because it's funny, he plays a note, and you will see on the graph, you'll see a spike, a spike, a spike, a spike, a spike, and it just goes boop, 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 all the way up to like 15 kilohertz. And you'll see this spike, and those are all of the harmonics that are playing when he plays one note. And every time he plays a different note, the harmonics shift, right? It's really cool to see. And that's what this is. So the note that's being played is 2. So you've got note 2 is being played, but as note 2 is being played, you get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all happening at the same time while you're listening. Okay? So harmonic content is super important when you're using EQs. Because equalizers, right? Everybody goes for like, oh, well, this is where the note is, so I'm gonna mess with that. Well, but that doesn't help necessarily. It also doesn't help by going like for a kick drum, right? Kick drums, their fundamentals are around 60 hertz-ish, somewhere around there. And they don't have upper harmonics that go as high as 10 kilohertz. They just don't exist. And so if someone says, I'm going to put an air EQ on this kick drum to make it sound better, you're not doing anything other than boosting the noise that came from that microphone or from the hall that you were in or the room or whatever. You're not boosting anything. It's not there because there aren't any harmonics up there. So you have to know kind of the harmonic spread of the instrument that you're playing or that you're recording. But also remember your entire mix has harmonic content. So if you want something to be brighter, you might not necessarily want to boost the upper harmonics because that might make it harsh and too present. What you might want to do is remove some of the lower harmonics. Just a little bit, not a lot, like 3 dB. And that will actually make the entire mix brighter because you've removed a little bit of the lower harmonics. Does that make sense how important harmonics can be? And when you think about like what instruments you're recording, the human voice if you're doing spoken word, right? One of the reasons, and I probably should have said this during the microphone thing, one of the reasons why this is really weird is because the human voice doesn't really have harmonics down where proximity effect gives it like heft. And so it doesn't sound right. It sounds artificial and weird. And it might sound okay depending on the genre you're in, or it might just sound okay at the time. But when you send that mix to someone, they're going to listen to it and they're going to go, something's not right with the vocals. They won't be able to tell you what isn't right with the vocals, but it'll be something. And it's because it doesn't sound realistic, because you've boosted the lower harmonics of a voice that we wouldn't normally hear in concert, if that makes sense. So it's something to think about when you're thinking about how you're EQing something. You're not just going in and hitting the notes that are there. You're there to alter the harmonic content of that instrument using the equalizer. So equalizers exist in the frequency domain. I don't think there's anything else that exists solely in the frequency domain other than equalizers. So now we have the third domain, time. By the way, if anybody has any questions, please stop me. Yes?
Okay, so notes are changing every beat or however, in the song. So you're not just repeating the solution with every note boosting exactly. How does that work? Are you doing it by key or something like that? Or?
I guess just in general. So we know, most songs are gonna sit within a particular range, right, of notes, and those harmonics are gonna overlap. And if you utilize this technique and you do tiny movements like 3 decibels, 4 decibels, something like that, you can use broader cues to sort of capture a larger swath of the harmonics. Like, I'm not saying to go in and find every single one and notch it out or something like that. That would just be weird. But if you take general cuts, then what you're doing is you're removing the upper harmonics from the whole thing. But yes, if you get too narrow, then as the notes change, you're going to hear harmonics pop out and then disappear and pop out and disappear and cause a weird sound effect. Although you might like this sound effect. So yeah.
So for an example, say I were to play a C add 9 chord, right?
Okay.
Would you be looking at the harmonics of the root, or would you be looking at it, say, of the root and the 9, and how would you approach that, or would it be just really circumstantial?
I would approach it as a group, and I wouldn't use a calculator to figure it out. I would use my ears. But I would approach it as the group sound, because each one of those notes, if it's on a piano or on a guitar, will have its own harmonic structure, right? And those all add together, and that's what gives us the complex structure of the chord. But it's just knowing that a guitar has a harmonic range of X to Y. And no matter what you play on that guitar, that's where the guitar fits in the mix. So you want to be acting within that range. And if you go online, you can find frequency bands of every instrument. And that usually gives you the general gist of how wide an instrument might be. As a trumpet player, I always find it very interesting that my width of playing is on an EQ is that big. I mean, it's not even that big. It's so tiny. It's maybe 3 octaves, 3.5 octaves. And that's just, that's adding the harmonics in, because I can't play 3 octaves. I'm not a screecher. I can't go all the way up to C7 or something silly like that. But some of the harmonics exist up there. And you have to think about that. Cymbals are really big for that. That was one of the reasons why when you compress a cymbal using lossy compression, I'm talking about data compression. If you listen to an MP3 that's very heavily cymbal based, and it's the old MP3, it always sounds like the cymbals in a fishbowl. It has that weird sound to it, and that's because all those upper harmonics that the cymbal have been gotten rid of, because the compression is humans can't hear that high, so we're just gonna dump it because it's not there. And it's okay, sort of, but harmonics exist up there to some extent. So yes, you'd use it as a group. Yes. Man, whenever I send an MP3 to anybody, it's always 324 or 320. It's always the highest that I can find. I know that what you get out of iTunes, I think, is still, unless you're listening to iTunes super quality, is 128 kilobits or something like that. So I always go as high as possible. But nowadays, with bandwidth being so high, I tend not to do anything with MP3 at all, ever. I just let it go. Yes?
So you know how different listening devices you have, they're not all the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a big thing. How do you get the bass there?
The translation. Yeah. Okay. So this was asked in the last lecture, and it'll be asked forever. So translation, that's what that is how do you get your mix to translate to different things, right? That's what you're basically saying. So this is the answer, and it's stupid simple. Things that stick out don't translate. So what you want to do is you want to make your mix sound good and not have anything stick out. And so the hard answer is your bass is going to sound terrible on a clock radio because clock radios can't play bass, right? I mean that's that. Like if we're listening to the speakers that are in the ceiling here, it's probably not going to be super great, right? Or in the Gap, or I guess is the Gap closed now? I don't know. Whatever. But if anybody still goes to malls, I don't know if that happens either anymore. But like when you listen to that music, you don't hear it a lot because there isn't a subwoofer, there isn't anything to play it. So what you could do is you can find a small speaker. Like I have this little box speaker. It's not an R-tone, but it's like a little shitty speaker that I have. Actually, I think it's from an old Macintosh. I don't know. I had it sitting in a box, and I just amplified it, and I run my mixes through it, and I listen. And if nothing sticks out, then the mix is going to translate. It will sound different in everything I listen to. Like this here. You'd think this would be stereo, right? But it's not. It's mono. It's just two mono signals being played at you. So when I played Monolith to you guys, you were listening to it in mono, which is different than the way I hear it. There's a lot of cool stuff that's in stereo on that piece that you can't hear. But it still sounds okay. Like nothing sticks out. And that's what's important. So how do you, so you can mitigate some of that. Like for instance, like if you've got a lot of bass in a track and you want it to be relevant on a smaller speaker, you might want to boost like 200 hertz because 200 hertz is playable on a small speaker. And not a lot of things exist in the 200 hertz range as far as instruments go. And so you could go in and you give that a little bit of a boost on like your kick drum or your bass or whatever is the bass instrument, your 808, whatever. And what that'll do is it'll give it a little bit of kick on the smaller speakers. So what you do is you find out what the smaller speakers do. Now, but also remember that if you've got a smaller speaker and you turn that bass way up so you hear it, when you put that on a bigger speaker, you might end up blowing the other speaker up because you've put too much bass in it. So you've got to just mitigate your expectations. The other thing you can do for translational purposes is pick something to mix on. And I don't care what it is. It can be Apple earbuds for all I give a crap. And you listen to everything that has ever been done that you listen to and love on those earbuds, right? You establish a reference. You say, I'm going to listen to everything on these things forever and ever. And you listen and you go and you find your favorite stuff and you listen to it and you internalize what that stuff sounds like. And then when you mix your stuff, you make it sound that way. Does that make sense? Like you have that reference in your head and you know that sounds good. So if you can get your stuff to be like that, then it's probably going to translate just fine. Like it's showing you what your equipment can do. And then you just sit in that box. So that is one of those things. But translation is all about making things in your mix not stick out. And that's why when you're listening to certain things, like let's say you have a pair of 7506 headphones, Sony's. They have almost no bass, but they've got tons of upper register stuff. And you're listening and you're like, wow, my bass sounds really good or my bass, like you're making the bass get louder and louder in those headphones until the bass sticks out. Well, now all of a sudden, when you put it on a different pair, that bass is going to be really sticking out. So you want everything to kind of just be even, and that's going to make everything translate. So, real quick, I'll come to the next question. So the time domain, right? So this is where anything that involves time exists. First thing, velocity. Sound has speed, 1,130 feet per second or 344 meters per second. What that means is if you delay something by 10 milliseconds, you are moving that thing back 10 feet. This is very, very helpful when you are trying to make something sound good, like a drum set, right? Drum set has multiple microphones. All of those microphones have to be what we call in phase in order for it to sound good. But all of those microphones are at a different distance from every other drum. So to make something sound really good, you've got to try to get it most in phase as possible to the loudest drums. So the loudest drums in a drum set are the kick drum and the snare, right? And so if you can get all the mics to be even, to be equidistant from the kick and the snare, your drum set will sound clear and have a lot of attack and a lot of tone. Be very good. Now you can do that two ways. You can be like me and measure all of the microphones from all of those drums and make sure they're in the right spot. Or you can go into your DAW and you can set up a delay to move those microphones by a certain number of milliseconds. Or you can just move the waveforms and do it that way also. But it's really interesting to realize that, let's say you want, let's say you have a singer that's like right up on this mic like this, and you want it to sound more like this back here. One of the things you can do is you can delay that sound. And by delaying that sound, all of a sudden in your mix, that vocalist will feel further away because you've given it delay, right? 10 milliseconds is 10 feet. That's a lot of feet. So maybe 5 milliseconds. That's 5 feet. That's pretty good. Or maybe even less, but a little bit of delay can give it direct delay, by the way, not feedback delay where you're having echoes happen. But like giving it that delay will actually push that instrument further back in the mix because our brains hear it as being further away because of that time delay. So delay can work to your advantage that way. So combined with changing some of the harmonic content, lowering the upper harmonics, you're also making it further back. Like you can make all of this happen at the same time. The other thing that happens with phase is when things are in phase, they get louder. When they're out of phase, meaning they're 188 degrees, they get softer. So if you've ever had a drum set where you've recorded a snare drum and the snare drum sounds, sounds okay, but it sounds kind of weird, or maybe it's like doesn't sound as full, you might want to look at phase, because what could be happening is the microphone that is on the snare could be combining with another microphone and it be out of phase with that other microphone. So you're actually subtracting tone, right? 180 degrees complete out of phase is like theoretical, and you can do it in your DAW, but you can't really do it in real life. But that's a thing. So you can actually reverse the phase, or you can line the waveforms up so they're in phase, and all of a sudden your snare drum or your kick drum or whatever will become much punchier and much clearer because it's now in phase. Phase is a huge, huge thing that people forget about. This is why when I do lectures about equalization or microphones, you don't want to use a lot of EQ in your mixes, because EQ operates off the concept of phase. It slightly delays the sound and adds it back to itself in order to create the boosts and the cuts that you've decided to do. It uses loops to do that. Well, every time you do that, you add a little bit of phase to that instrument, phase problems. So let's say you've got 128 tracks, and each one of those tracks has 3 EQs on it, doing different things, mind you, so adding different phase problems to each one of those instruments. You add that all together, and now all of a sudden your mix sounds fuzzy. Like, it's not like literally fuzzy, it doesn't have like hiss in it, but it doesn't sound as clear. It sounds like there's like a veil over it. If that happens, you've got too much processing, most likely. So that's why when I record, I do my best to get as close to the sound that I think needs to be there with the microphones and with the placement. And what that does is it allows me to use less EQ, which then makes my music sound clearer in the end. So that's important to think about. How much processing you do can do that, because then someone will say, well, we'll use a linear phase EQ. That doesn't put any phase into it. You're absolutely correct, except it causes ringing. So it has other things that are issues. that you have to think about. So I try to use as little processing as possible to get where I'm trying to go, right? You can't fix it in the mix. All right, last thing. I know I said I'd do 7, but you get a bonus because you're all here. And that is shape. Sound has shape. But now we're talking what we all know and love. So pure and synthetic sound. Pure sound is a sine wave. So everything we listen to in real life is some combination of sound waves, right? But we also have synthetic sound. This is all done with additive synthesis. So, and unfortunately, I always mess it up, so I'm not going to actually say these things, but something. When you add a certain amount of harmonics, I think it's odd harmonics, but I'm not sure, together, you end up with a triangle wave. Triangle waves are used in, and we all know and love them, right? NES games, right? Triangle waves were used as the bass and sometimes the kick drum. Okay, square waves we're always used for some melodic content because they are very strident sounding. So we have these waves that are created by the chips that give us your beloved chiptune music, right? It's all made, chiptune music is all made out of square waves, triangle waves, and I guess to some extent sawtooth waves, but I think it's more square triangle. But don't quote me on that because I'm not a chiptune expert and I don't know. But I guess if chiptune is defined by what a 8-bit audio chip could do, then yes, it is just square waves and triangle waves and white noise, because it could do white noise too. That was all the snare drum stuff, was the ch sound. So it could do white noise. It was 3 channels: white noise, square wave, triangle wave. Maybe 4 channels, maybe 2 square waves. I don't know. But shape gives us different textures, and in electronic music you can use those textures. Like a triangle wave has a very specific sound, square waves have very specific sounds. This is how the Moog synthesizer was created. So you would have multiple oscillators on the Moog synthesizer, or Moog, I guess it's Moog. I always called it Moog, but I think it's Moog. You have multiple oscillators, and those oscillators can be then acted upon by, delays and all sorts of other things, how they add together. But in the end, they add together to create a sound that you then play on a keyboard and get different pitches. So that controlled the pitch that you were doing, but the different oscillators and how they added together gave you the particular sound you were going for. The thing about the Moog synthesizers, it could never play the 2 notes at the same time. It could only play. It was a monophonic device. Right, so that's something that you need to understand about this. Pure sound is sine waves. So like the flute is one of the closest instruments we have to a pure sine wave. There's people who play the glass harp, which is a table full with glasses filled with water, and they move their hands over it. Those actually produce pure sine waves. And create a very pure sound to them. We tend to use sine waves as measurement devices because they're very consistent. And so, like, if you're trying to get a level on a mixer, you might feed it a 1 kilohertz sine wave at a particular volume so that all of your channels could be referenced to something that's consistent. But again, this is still a characteristic of synthesized sound, is how we add all of those together. And what's funny is it's how you add the harmonics, how you add the harmonic content together that gives you the different sounds. All right, so that's it. That's all I have right now. So what are your questions? What are your thoughts? You can ask me whatever you want. Real quick before I answer that, one in the back is if you want to contact me, talk to me, have questions, want me to listen stuff, whatever, you have my info down here. Feel free. I will talk to anybody and help you out. So, question in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
So I usually do piano and vocals.
Okay.
And I wanted to ask, so I try to get more of a performance hall sound, so I kind of bust everything into a reverb and then into another reverb. And just to try and get 2 reverbs and then both of them into another reverb so they both have sort of the same.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sound. And I wanted to ask, since it's a performance hall and
since you're kind of using a lot of reverb, do you really need any sort of delay in that regard? And also, how would you, just as a generalization, what would be the first things that you would look at when all the recording is there and it's just one piano and one voice? How would you kind of go about trying to mix that, just in a general sense?
So with piano and voice, I would look at it as, you know, your piano. Is it are you recording an acoustic piano or is it MIDI?
Mostly MIDI.
Okay, that's fine. Well, right, but I mean 6 of 1 doesn't really matter. Only because in my head it depends on what kind of patch you're using. So if you're using like let's say the CFX patch from whatever, Yamaha, I don't remember the name, Garrison or Grecian or something like that. I don't know the name of it, but it sounds like a real piano. So I would think of it as like, where do you want the person to be versus the piano? The piano's big, so the piano's going to be stereo. It's going to be wide, and you're going to want that voice to be in the middle because that's where we want to hear it. So I would have the piano pound out wide, and I'd have the voice in the middle. I would listen to the piano, and I'd make sure that there's a space in the piano because a piano has a lot of harmonic content, a huge breadth of it, right? So you want to make sure that the vocal doesn't. The vocal's got a really narrow area. So you want to make sure that you go in and you either compositionally create a hole for the vocal to sit in, or after you've played the piano, you go in and use an equalizer to eliminate some of the harmonic content in the area in which the vocal sits. Okay, because that's what's going to happen when you listen to that mix. The piano is going to cover up the vocal at certain times because it will play over the vocalist's harmonic content, thus covering it up because it might be louder. And instead of trying to make it be softer there, you can actually use some of the EQ to remove some of that harmonic content to let it sit in there. Now, as far as using lots of reverbs, you don't need a delay because that's what reverbs are. Reverbs are delay. They operate in the time domain. That's where reverbs sit, right? So what I would recommend is I would use a room reverb, something that's relatively short, to make the piano sound more realistic because it's in a place, right? And even the vocal a little bit more realistic. And then once you have that, then you can bus those same things. So you're not busing the roomed reverb to big reverb. You're busing the dry signal to 2 reverbs at the same time. Does that make sense? And then bust them all to like a hall reverb that gives it much more breadth, and it'll sound like it's in a hall. But he's talking about using what is called parallel processing to create a room sound where you have control over the dry signal, which is the direct signal, and the reverberation or the hall signal. And that's what we want to, the more reverbs you use, you want to try to use them that way because you have more control than just the mix knob on the front. Yes, again.
Along with that, you say that you want to have the piano wide.
Yeah.
What I've been doing previously is having the voice in the middle, but then I have 2 of the same piano part on both the left and right. And since if I'm trying to contextualize it right with your presentation here, since both of them are in phase and they get louder because you're using 2 of them, would you just turn down the dBs on both of them, or is there a different way of how you would make it pan wide in a different way than I did?
Okay, so what I would do is I would try to find a plugin that will utilize a stereo piano. That would be the first thing I do. So a software instrument that has low stuff on the right and high stuff on the left. Okay? I know that's weird, but pianos, like when you listen to a piano from out there, the high stuff is on the left, and the low stuff is on the right. But you have it so that it's like gradually panning the piano via that way. If you are stuck with mono synths and you want to make that sound stereo, then I would slightly delay one of the sides. Because no matter what you do, if you have the same thing coming out of left and right, it's not stereo, it's mono, right? it won't be stereo unless there's two different things coming out of either side. And so you might be able to delay one a little bit to give it a little bit of width, add some kind of processing to it to make it slightly different, but you want different things coming out of either speaker to make it stereo. Yes?
So just as the last question then, is Addictive Keys sort is one of those plugins that can do a stereo band off the top of your head?
Which? Say that one more time. Is
Addictive Keys.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I would assume so. Yeah, I would assume that you would have that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I play trumpet, and
Oh, congratulations, fellow trumpet player.
yeah, I'm self-taught, and whenever I try to record the trumpet, sometimes I would get like the sound of the, I guess, beat going into it.
Yep.
I just want to know if that's like a problem with the miking or if it's with my playing.
It could be both, but no, most of the time it's miking. Like I won't assume unless I've heard you play. But in general, so what he's saying is trumpet is a wind instrument, right? We blow in it. And what that sounds like is this. Okay? I mean, there's nothing you can do to get rid of that. Now we have tone, but the trumpet is meant to be heard. Like if I play the trumpet here, you're out there hearing the trumpet. So you're hearing the trumpet in the room. If you came really close to my bell, you would hear like this constant stream of air because that's how you have to play the trumpet. So what we end up having to do, and even in performances, when I perform, I always turn in one direction. I tend to turn this way because I see better out of this eye. But like I turn this way so that I am not pointed directly at my audience. Because yeah, the people in the middle row will think it sounds fine, but everybody in the front of the row is going to be like, wow, that guy sounds really bad, right? And it's because of that air. So what I would do is if, like, this is the trumpet, here the trumpet bell, right, playing the trumpet, I would mic it this way, right? So this is called off-axis miking, and so I'm playing this way, but I'm miking from this side, or whatever side. You could even do it like from the top or whatever, from the bottom. But what you're doing is you're not putting the trumpet dead on the mic. You're putting it off this way, and that way what happens is the mic is picking up more of the resonance of the trumpet and less of the air coming out. But again, I would also highly recommend that when you play the trumpet that you like get a recorder and throw it out there, like throw it in your room somewhere just to make sure that it isn't you, because it could be partly that. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, you listen to Miles Davis and his trumpet tone was incredibly airy. But again, they mic'd him from the top. Like they put a mic up here and he played underneath the mic. So that's generally how I do all brass instruments, is I mic from a resonant side as opposed to being in front. Like the trumpet there was all done in a studio, when the monolith trumpet was done in a studio, and I mic'd off to the side, like I mic'd here and recorded it that way. Yeah, any other questions? Yes?
Maybe this is too general, but do you have a preferred method for, say, an acoustic guitar player wants you to record them? What would be like your most bang for your buck, like lowest effort, highest quality sound way to mic that guitar player in less than ideal, like not in a treated room, let's say?
Okay, cardioid microphone on the whatever the fret that's right at the spot where the neck and the body meet. And I would point it and I would adjust the distance depending on how much room you want, how little room you want. Single microphone. Okay, so here's my thing about stereo things, okay? Big things are stereo, small things are mono. If you record a guitar in stereo, then if the guitarist moves, it'll move. So if the guitarist is playing like this and stays perfectly still, then everything's fine. But as soon as they do that, all of a sudden when you're listening to it, you'll hear the image shift. And if they do this, boy, that's not okay. Then all of a sudden, like you're hearing it go back and forth, and you're like, oh, this is making me sick, right? So like a piano, you could make stereo because pianos are really big, right? Drums are stereo because drums are big. I mean, drum sets are big, trap sets. But like a guitar, I hear as a point. Like I hear it as a point source. So I don't like doing it in stereo. So I would use one microphone, cardioid, and point. And so the higher you go up the fretboard, the brighter that's going to be because you're getting further away from what makes the tone in a guitar, which is the body. And the closer you get to the tone hole, the boomier it's going to get because that's where all the tone is. So you kind of have to balance depending on what it is. Like steel strings, you might want a little lower so you don't get as much rasp from it, down the neck. But I stay on the strings and I move up and down depending on how bright I want it to be. And then you can move it back and forth to blend in how much room you want. So typically when you mic something, anything, the distance to it is going to give you how much direct sound it is as opposed to room sound. So if you want something to sound roomier, you move it back. That's why people have room mics for drums, right? Because they want to capture the tone of the room, so they put them far back. If you want a pure sound, you bring it forward. The problem is when you have a pure sounding instrument, our brains are like, man, that guitar's got to be like right up against my ear because there's no room, there's no distance, right? So you have to be careful with that because then it sounds unnatural, right? So you got to find the sort of the sweet spot. And if you have a really bad room, then you can make it sound super close and then use delays and reverbs to bring some of that room back and to make it sound more natural at that point. But yeah, one microphone, cardioid because you want to take away as much of the room as possible, and then move it back and forth across the strings until you get the sound that you want. If you get too much attack, you can actually tilt the microphone at an angle, and that will get rid of, like if you've got good tone but too much attack, you can turn it a little bit towards the tone hole, like this way, like that, so that the strings it's picking up the strings from the side of the microphone, like at 45 degrees. That'll take some of the edge off of the pluck and off of the strumming. But yeah, that's what I would do. Question back there? Yep.
I might have missed it, but is Monolith on an album that's available anywhere?
Monolith is on an album. It is not available yet, but it will be available, and it will be on the Fundamental Sounds Twitter when I release it. We are awaiting copyright approval. As we all know, you can't steal things. Stealing things is bad. So I am in negotiation with a publisher at the moment, but it will be up pretty soon because it's finished. It's I'm just waiting to get approval and pay all my mechanical fees. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any resources for like mic placement for a variety of instruments? Like I'll play kind of obscure instruments like ear boot and accordion, and I'm not really sure where to place microphones for those.
Okay, so I don't have any specific resources to find specific instruments. However, thinking about fundamental principles, what you do is find out, like, where are you supposed to hear an accordion? Like, what produces the sound and where are you supposed to hear it? So, like, for instance, a horn, right? I won't call it a French horn because French hornists are like, it's not from France. But the horn, right? Sorry, my wife's a horn player, so I can do that. You don't put a microphone behind a horn because no one wants to be behind a horn, right? Because that's where all the noise comes from. I mean, I played in orchestras for years, and you were always behind the horns, and it was like this blast of just nastiness. And horns are meant to be heard from the front. So if you ever see someone miking a horn from the back, they don't understand how a horn works. So when you're recording horn, you want the mic in front of the horn. So for an accordion, right, you're playing an accordion, what is making the noise? Like, I know it's you're squeezing the air, but like, what is the thing that makes the noise, right? And then what you do is you put the mic where you would optimally want to be listening to this. And that's where you put it. And so maybe it's like dead in front of you, but maybe a foot away or something. That gives you that, again, the balance between the room and the instrument. The other thing, like a clarinet, you don't put a mic at the bottom of a clarinet. You put it in front of the clarinet, because no one listens to a clarinet on the bottom. They listen on the front. It's actually the tone that is resonating from the instrument. So you put it in front, or an oboe, or a bassoon, right? You don't stick the mic up in the bassoon over here. You stick it in front of the bassoon, because that's where things are. Now on a trumpet, that's a little different, right? Because you're not meant to be in the front of a trumpet, much like not in the front of a horn. So you turn the trumpet player so that it's not in the way, right? And so you always want to put the mic where you would want to listen to it. And that, granted, no one wants to put their ear against a snare drum, but sometimes, right, like if you got a good drummer, you don't need to have a bunch of mics on your drums. You can just have a stereo pair and it'd be great. But if you have a less than good drummer, then you need multiple microphones. And that's what you do it that way, right? I'm being told to wrap it up. So if you have any more questions, feel free. I can stand out in the hallway or you can come talk to me while I'm packing up. Again, anything else, contact me. And I will contact you back. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of MAGFest and Sunday. Thank you.